So welcome to today's webinar, Inclusion and Diversity in the Labor Market, which is hosted by the Migrations and Diversity Research Group of Eurac Research. This webinar series explores the impact of migrations, diversities, and mobilities, taking an interdisciplinary approach which draws on the expertise of the different institutes that within Eurac Research study the issue of migration. My name is Johanna Mitterhofer, and I'm an anthropologist at the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research, studying mainly issues of migration, identities, and borders in plural societies. And I have the honor today to moderate the webinar with our three speakers, which I will introduce shortly. The webinar, as I said, is titled Diversity and Inclusion in the Labor Market, and it looks at how diversity and inclusion policies can be powerful tools in promoting the interests, the needs of underrepresented marginalized groups. They're also necessary to foster the potential that diversity has or can have for social and economic innovation and growth. And in the first part of this webinar, we explore the challenges and opportunities associated with promoting diversity and inclusion in the labor market, including and focusing on the strategies adopted by companies and the benefits of diversity for both companies and employees. And we then open up the discourse on diversity and inclusion to then explore the potential of migrant entrepreneurship as a valuable resource for innovation, in addition to providing alternative avenues for the inclusion of marginalized groups. And to discuss these issues with me today, I have three experts studying diversity in the labor market from various perspectives. So first, my colleague Marzia Bona from the Institute for Regional Development at Eurac Research. She has worked on several applied research projects exploring mobilities and migrations in mountain areas. And currently she studies the issue of access to housing and stable, decent forms of employment through diversity management tools. Today, she will present first insights from a new study on attitudes towards and practices of diversity management in South Tyrolean companies. Second up is Maura di Mauro, who is an intercultural and diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer and consultant who brings a more applied perspective to this talk by sharing her long experience of working with companies, universities, other institutions in the field. From 2016 to 2019, she was the president of the Society for Intercultural Education, Training and Research, CITAR in Italy, and board member of CITAR Europe. She has taught and written extensively on the topics of intercultural training, diversity, inclusion management, and on intercultural competencies. Maura has also shared some links to some of these publications with us, and I'll post them later in the chat. And our third speaker is Claudia Lintner. She's a sociologist and junior professor at the Free University of Bozen-Bolzano here in Italy. And her research interests are mainly in the sociology of migration, and there she focuses on migrant entrepreneurship, which will be the focus of her contribution today, but also the role of social work in the context of crisis, on refugees and their everyday coping strategies in border areas, and so on. So thanks to all three of you for having accepted this invitation to be here today with me to discuss various aspects related to diversity and inclusion in the labor market. Thank you also to the thank you and welcome also to the audience. This is a webinar, so you unfortunately are not able to talk with us, but you are very welcome to post your questions, comments during or after the talk using either the Q&A function or the chat. The webinar will be recorded and posted later on the webinar website, the link of which I'll also post in the chat, so you'll have a chance to watch it again or share it with others and look up what other webinars we have had in this series, Diversity Matters. I think this is all for introductions and housekeeping. So let's now start with Marzia Bona. So you, over the last couple of months, you have studied diversity management in South Tyrol, how companies define it, how, if they deal with diversity. What have you found out?
Thank you, Johanna, also for setting up this great panel. And it's a pleasure to be sharing for the first time the preliminary result of this work we did. So I did prepare a PowerPoint with some hints on the definitions that we use in approaching the topic of diversity management. So maybe I would like to start from there to then get to answer your question in the 10 minutes that are given to me. So let me share my screen and let me start the presentation. Can you let me know if it works now? Yes. Yeah, so these are the basic definitions from which we moved in order to approach if and how diversity management is perceived in South Tyrol. And these are the definition we use that point out some aspects that I think are relevant in approaching the topic in a context such as South Tyrol. First of all, it is a set of policies, practices, and actions that are mostly enacted by human resources. So with in comparison with other approaches to handling diversity in the workforce, we don't have mandatory measures mandated by law. It's up to human resources departments for those firms that are big enough to have one, or for who is in charge of dealing with the personnel within a firm or a company to decide if and how they are approaching this topic. Then the second definition that you see in this slide points out another aspect that I think is relevant, that has to do with this two-level objectives of diversity management. So not only it invites to change the perspective and to frame diversity as a potential and not as a burden, and this is the basic principle, but it also aims to reach two objectives. The first is to enhance the performance of the firms through more efficient innovation process, interaction process within the workforce. Once we manage to have a productive interaction among diversity within the firm, and then, but of course not less important, it should also allow an inclusive development of the workforce, meaning that each and every person employed is able to improve, gain a better position, gain new skill, and so on and so forth. So somehow it is a tool also to prevent and tackle workforce segregation. And these are the two basic definitions from which we moved. What I want to point out also is that in comparison with previous approaches that are known as affirmative actions, especially in the US labor market, diversity management invites this change of perspective. So let's frame diversity as an opportunity rather than an obstacle. But how did we get to this change of perspective? I think this quote by Thomas explains it very well. So at the beginning of the 90s, especially in the US, they came to the situation in which, using the words of Thomas, women and minorities no longer needed a boarding pass to get into the labor market because they were already an integral part of the workforce. They just needed, and just it's between commas, they just needed the possibility to upgrade their position, to improve, to get out of the silos and the segregated position in which they would normally be relegated once they had entered the labor market. So moving from these definitions, which are better compared in this table, I'm not going through it, but you will then get it through with the slides, so you can. But basically, this table compares the key points differentiating these two approaches. So moving from these concepts, we approach it firms and companies in South Tyrol. What did we do? We conducted something more than 20 interviews, semi-structured interviews with companies of different sizes and working in different sectors. We also interviewed trade unions and associations representing different sectors, so tourism, agriculture. We tried somehow to map the entire spectrum of economic activities in the province. Asking them first what was their perception of relevant diversities within their firms, and then even how they were dealing with this diversity in a structured manner. What we found out is that the topic of diversity per se, so here we are making a step back, we're not discussing diversity management yet, but talking about diversity, it is of course very well rooted in the province, mostly because through the established managing of linguistic diversity in the province. So there is awareness, there is recognition of diversity in the labor market. There is also a second point a broad understanding of diversity. So when we ask what is diversity in your firm, they mentioned a broad range of dimension, moving from gender to linguistic dimension, ethnic and cultural, age, disability, education, religion, and sexual orientation. The thing is that they were not, all these dimensions were not mentioned in neutral terms, so they were not listed as equally relevant to the labor market or equally providing opportunities or constraints, but we found out there is a sort of hierarchy of diversity. What does it mean? That for those dimensions of diversity where there is a regulation mandated by law, firms prove somehow to be quite relaxed, meaning that they know there are things to be respected, measures to be adopted. They can, in some cases, they declare themselves satisfied or in line with this expectation. In some other, they face some difficulties, but they know what they have to do. And this doesn't apply to those dimensions of diversity that have to do with the diversity brought in by the migration experience. Because in this case, firms have much less guidance, know less what they have to do, and feel very often alone in dealing with this diversity. And more specifically, the challenges that firms mention in more often when interviewed by us had to do with bureaucratic difficulties. So very often uncertain legal status that force workers with a migration background to be very volatile. And referring to the situation in the province of South Tyrol, we are also facing a very intense housing crisis that leave many foreign workers outside the private labor housing market, which means that many of them are forced to leave their work and the province because they cannot find a suitable accommodation. And this is the reason why they leave their job, with costs also for employees, of course. And this was the first dimension that was quoted in more recurrent manner. Then, of course, they mentioned prejudices on the side of employees, but also on the side of clients, which gives rise to labor market segregation, meaning that those persons with a migration background that have a very visible belonging or very visible affiliation that makes them recognizable as with a migration background are somehow prevented to take certain tasks, for instance, face-to-face with clients. And last but not least, there is, of course, the linguistic dimension, which has to do with the implicit requirement of bilingualism in the province, Italian and German, but not only this, also the local dialect, which is much more difficult to acquire because there are less chances of formal education in this specific skill. So moving from diversity to diversity management, when we ask the direct question if and how they are acquainted with the term and implementing measure, what we got as a response in a very short summary has to do with the following point. So the concept of diversity management was known by most of the respondents, although they couldn't really provide a structured definition, so they are not acquainted with the long-term approach that is implied by diversity management. It was not implemented by any of the firms we consulted, even if some of them are really big, so they have quite big human resource departments. We could find out that even if they don't have structured programs of diversity management, still they could provide us examples of good practices that they implement specific measures that are somehow scattered around the entire range of phases in the company life. So from recruitment process opened up to diversity, to the inception mentoring, so mentoring by co-nationals or by older colleagues to facilitate the integration into the labor team, team building measures, and so on. So there are good examples that can somehow be regarded as best practices to be maybe spread around and exchanged among economic actors working in the province. Then one point on which there was almost 100% agreement is that there is no diversity training foreseen nor for manager nor for employees, which makes a good point for some action to be taken in the next future. And then, of course, the size of the company matters, not only because a small company very likely will not have a human resources department, but also because the type of measures to be adopted vary very much. What we found out, nevertheless, is that even very small firms are capable in very flexible and innovative manner to somehow find creative solution to accommodate the diversity of their workforce. So to close my presentation, the last slide discusses the motivation that have to do somehow with the genuinity and with how far can we go in the current situation when we discuss about diversity management in this local context. What we got as an answer when asking companies which are the motivation for them to engage into measures, policies, and actions to deal the diversity of their workforce, it was almost unanimous the fact that they identified the shortage of workforces as the main motivation, meaning that we need to build a strong and good and positive reputation in order to attract, and once attracted, retain workers, because we are facing an intense crisis when it comes to recruitment, which is per se a strong motivation. We are not convinced it is the good motivation to really set the ground for a genuine and all-encompassing program of diversity management. So the take-home message that we got from this preliminary study that we are willing to deepen in the next months is that the recognition of diversity and the need to be proactive in managing it is well present in the province, yet it is definitely not seen yet as a resource, rather than as an issue to be dealt with in terms of containing the negative effects it can have. And with this, I hope I stayed in my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Marzia. Perfect.
And I leave the
Perfect
word
timing
to the other speaker.
Yeah, thank you. Maura, you have extensive experience in training and consulting employers, companies, universities, and so on issues related to diversity and equity and inclusion. So I was wondering if the insights that Marzia now presented and some of the reflections, if they also reflect your experience in working closely with those companies, and what, in your view, are the key challenges in the practical implementation of diversity inclusion, of diversity management that these employers and companies you are often in contact with experience. So if you would want to give us your insights, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation and for be the second one to follow up to Marzia Bona insights. Definitely, there are some of the highlights that she focused on that remind me some of the main issues I wanted to point out. First of all, we cannot really generalize. We need to make some specification when we talk about diversity, equality, and inclusion, and when we talk about migrants. One of the first specification or definition, better definition, is that there is a quite variegate intervention of measure depending on if we are talking about European migrants or EU migrants or extra-European, because most of the European funding for supporting companies in projects of diversity and inclusion or in migrants inclusion in the labor markets are focused on non-European migrants. So third country migrants are also called. Because there are, first of all, because the bureaucratic aspects that Marzia underlined, there is a difference in the possibility of mobility within the area of Europe. Of course, the not European, most of the time, they enter or with a work permission, or most of the time with in an illegal way, or with a tourist visa, or with a refugee, or with a status, which is one of the first problems that many companies and all the actors, I would say, are involved in including migrants into the job market. Those are some of the main issues they face at the beginning. Secondly, we cannot make a generalization considering the corporate size, because small, well, we know in Italy, we cannot even generalize in Italy, because the Trentino Alto Adige region is quite different, of course, at least for the bilingualism aspect is very different from the majority of the other Italian regions. Also because it gives you the awareness. Marzia said many people already have the awareness of diversity because you used to the language diversity. So many other companies, I will say, especially micro or a small size company, they do not even have the awareness of the diversity. And then there are the corporate company. So we have in Italy, let's say the 30%, 40% of our economy is based on a medium-sized company, which are the ones that they start to have some HR process. So they start to think about how can I better manage my workforce, but they also, many times they do not have the right skill in order to be able to implement some diversity and inclusion practice, at least on the human resource processes side, I would say. And then there are the corporates. The corporates, they have the management tools, particularly in practice, they have the capabilities in HR, and they are better, they are also more sensitive toward the diversity. Many times they have the quota that oblige even the Italian branches to do something about diversity. I would say migrants is still not the first focus in our country. I would say gender and disabilities are still the main two focus on which most of the company are working. Now also there is also the gender certification, and of course more and more companies, they will focus on mostly gender, I would say. But there are also many intersectionality. We talk about migration, the lower employment rate comes from women migrants. So we have two variables of diversity which impact on the unemployment rate. Indeed, this category, they are the most net, so neither with employment or education, neither in training. And there are many challenges that explain this phenomenon. One of these are, well, are general, like the bureaucratic or the language or unskilled. And the other are definitely cultural differences. We know that most of the migrant women that are not employed, they come also from countries or from cultures where women normally do not used to actively work in society. And so it's a huge spectrum of reasons that need to be considered. And I would say what is happening is that definitely there are industry, Marzia mentioned some of the main industry with a higher rate of employability that have actually a skills shortage. And those companies in these industries are the ones that more than other need to look for migrants as possible employers, because we know that we have the Italian workforce that unfortunately are not available to accept certain job or roles anymore. And we have on the other side a high demand in some roles and some industry that need to be covered. I think, of course, there are also, despite the companies, a big role in the inclusion process comes from the job agency, because they are the ones who create the matches between the offers and then the job demands, and they try to also create learning path for reskilling or upskilling in order to reduce the gap between the offers and the demands. What I see is that there are many projects, many, I would say, many actors are doing many things. I think many times what is done is not systemic. I mean, everyone does his own part, but also because of the limits of the funding, I see many replication in what the different actors are doing. I see companies very pragmatically, the companies who have or who are interested in hiring migrants is because they have a skill shortage and they need to fill in the roles they need. And so they recognize also somehow the value of migrants, because they give them the possibility of having available roles that otherwise they wouldn't have. But many times there is a lack of accompany the process of inclusion, because like hiring migrants, it means to increase the diversity rate or the diversity, the demography of the workforce. But this is not enough in order to be able, first of all, to manage effectively migrants, and secondly, to make diversity an added value for companies, because of course there are opportunities, but there are a lot of challenges. And so some of the challenges that migrants as employees face have been already also mentioned by Marzia. Definitely there is a language problems at the beginning. Then it really depends who we are talking about. So as I said before, we cannot completely generalize, but if we focus on new arrived migrants or third country migrants, of course, there is an issues with language, with not knowing the job market. Many times migrants who arrive, they are disoriented, not only in the job market, but in general in their own projects. They don't have a long-term visibility, and many times they accept they accept working condition that no one else Italian would accept, simply because they have an urgency. They need to earn money, they need to survive, they need to send money back home. And this is not positive, neither for them, neither for the job market, of course. Also because in the long term, which they are not aware of, by accepting every kind of condition, every kind of working on employment condition, in the long term, they are not, it might be that they become net, they are able to work in a short term. For any reason, they might lose the job, they might be fired later on, the working condition can change. And then if they didn't develop any skills, or if they didn't do anything else in order to be better included, not only in the work side, but also in the social and cultural side, at the end, they remain at the border of society, and also from the re-employability, it's very difficult that they are able to be re-employed later on. And then, so there is this short-term vision, and many times they do not understand that they need to train themselves, they need to keep learning, they need to invest on themselves instead of accepting any kind of working condition at the beginning. And of course, there are other general of problems that can, like the lack of networking, the lack of knowing people that can help them or support them to get a job, and so on. So, and then of course, some other problems are connected, especially with refugees. There is also psychological trauma, sometimes linked with the refugee and with the migrant's journey. So this is another aspect. Many times NGOs or public authority, they develop some project, and some of them, they consider also this psychological aspect, which can be very important. On the other side, the employers, so companies, I would say that they have the short skill needs, so they need people, but many times they're not prepared, especially if we consider small, micro size or small enterprise. They don't have neither the HR function many times. And in the medium-sized enterprises, sometimes the HR function, they do not have the intercultural skill or the diversity and inclusion skills. So they might be sensitive, but they don't have the capabilities to manage effectively those inclusive process. So they are not able to think about, despite the recruitment and selection, how can I guarantee that this person will bring me value within the company? Especially small, medium-sized enterprise, they consider training as a cost, not as an investment. And this is also, we can see it many times, they offer language training, but the total amount of hours for the language training is very short. So sometimes it's not sufficient in order to become fluent in speaking the local language. And probably some other project could be, could support the language learning despite the class that can be paid by courses. And something else is even coming back to the role of HR, sometimes they do not have the skill, and sometimes they do not have the power to be able to transform diversity inclusion, not from a tool to a strategy. Because many times it's considered a tool for recruitment and selection, but is not integrated with other organizational processes, and they're not able to create the advantage of diversity. And sometimes even who is responsible of the recruitment and selection, they are not aware of their own bias. And again, they do not have the intercultural skills or diversity inclusion skills in order to rethink about the recruitment and selection process. So those are, in my view, the challenges from both sides. There are also some solutions. I mean, it's not that do not exist interesting inclusive processes or practices. There are. And actually, they became one of the tools of the expertise tool of more professional HR or managers, or even recruiter and selector operators that can be used in order to accompany the process of migrants' inclusion.
And this is something that we can maybe then come back to later if we still have time. You already addressed the issue of migrants within the labor market, and you talked about often short-term vision, the need to do any kind of job. Claudia, you yourself studied this issue of diversity in the labor market from this perspective of the migrants themselves, in particular focusing on migrant entrepreneurs, so not migrants who are employed by local companies, but migrants who often are employers themselves or are just business owners and so on. So can migrant entrepreneurship in a way be considered an avenue of inclusion? And what is in a way the relevance of diversity management here? Is there any connection? Is there any relevance there? Or is it a completely different issue?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to this panel. I'm interested in migrant entrepreneurship since 2015, and in fact it was the argument of my PhD thesis. And since then I'm very interested in alternative forms of integration in the labor market, studying not only migrant entrepreneurship but also social entrepreneurship in a more general perspective. So today I will focus on migrant entrepreneurship, and I will give some insights into the results of my study that I did on migrant entrepreneurship. So when we look to big European cities like Paris, London, Berlin, we all know that migrant entrepreneurship is a very integrated part of urban context and urban everyday life. So just thinking about Little China or Little Italy, and because in urban context, this phenomena has a very long history, has a very long tradition. And this is also true for Italy. So also in Italy, in particular in urban context, we have this migrant entrepreneurship as an integrated part, as a form of consolidated form of integration into the labor market. So against this background, why I started to study migrant entrepreneurship from a socially innovative perspective, there was a crucial moment when I read a statistic survey carried out by a foundation in Venice in 2014. And they wrote that since 2010, so right after the economic crisis, there was a kind of boom of the number of migrant entrepreneurs in Italy, while at the same time the number of native entrepreneurs decreased by 7.4%. So when we just look on how the composition of this group in Italy, we can say that most are largely concentrated in the retail sector, in the wholesale trade or construction sector, and 35% of them are opening shops or small businesses in the service sector. When we look at the different communities, we can say that those most willing to open up small shops and to undertake this adventure are people from Morocco, followed by people from China and people from Romania in Italy. So in contrast to other Italian regions, South Tyrol comprises a very low number of migrant entrepreneurs. This can be traced back to a very short history on international migration, and traced back also to the geographical position of South Tyrol. Nevertheless, also here we can see an increase of about 25.7% of migrant entrepreneurs. And so we see also here for the province the importance of migrant entrepreneurship for the economic development. And I could observe that by myself, like also you maybe did, when just walking through the streets of Bolzano or Brixen, for example, the Garibaldi Street in Bolzano, or also the Roncadgasse in Brixen, we can observe this pop-up of small businesses and shops of migrants themselves. And after interviewing migrant entrepreneurs, I understood that self-employment can be described as a possible personal valuable strategy to overcome unemployment and irregular income, in particular in times of crisis. So there is a connection between society crisis, the limits of the limits of the gainful employment market, particularly in these periods. However, when looking at all these single shops and small businesses, it can be said that they are functioning in a very isolated way. So they are functioning in a very personal, they are organized on a very personal level. They are individual projects that are not linked with each other. So migrant entrepreneurship in South Tyrol is still a very personal answer to a structural challenge, and such as unemployment or discrimination, and that their activities are strictly rooted in their life worlds, in their networks, in their family ties. So when opening a shop, they rely strictly on personal resources, on personal, social and cultural capital, and not on institutional support measures and structures. So when we think about social innovation, social innovative aspects linked to migrant entrepreneurs, we can see that socially innovative aspects on a very micro level, on a very micro sociological level. For example, as it was also said before, the gainful employment market is generally not interested in the individuals, in the skills that people have, in the competences that people have. So they are following economic goals to promote economic growth, but they are not so much interested in reuse the competences of migrants. So from this perspective, self-employment changes a little bit this perspective, because the self-employment project is based on competencies, is based on their own skills. So for example, and is closely fit into their biography. And for example, comes into my mind a barber that opens up a shop as a barber. He does not so because he just wants to work as a barber, but he has learned it. He was trained by his father in Bangladesh, for example. So he, with this project as self-employment, they construct somehow a continuity, what happens before the migration and what happens after. So there is a continuity in their biography, and work turns out to be not just something to earn money with, but it becomes also a meaningful activity for them. So actually what is it? It is for most of us, we are trying to do what is meaningful. Migrants often do not have this possibility to choose what they want to work. And these small projects that allows them to do also something meaningful for them. There is a second point that I would like to underline, is that they are opening shops, but they are not just offering services, but they are also offering new negotiation spaces for the native population. So for example, I remember always this barber that told me that he wanted to open the shop for his community, and now he has much more clients from South Tyrol than he has from his community. So that means, he said, that obviously they are afraid, so they pass by once, they pass by twice, and then they enter, and they are not just getting a service, but they get also the possibility to talk, to negotiate the we and the other, and to initiate some kind of, or promote kind of intercultural communication, kind of integration, or however we want to call that. But we have these possibilities on, so we see that migrant entrepreneurship, the potential that lies behind, is not just for them, but could be also potential for society, for an inclusive city, for an inclusive street, for inclusive society as a whole. So on these two levels, on this micro level in particular, we can, migrant entrepreneurship represents something very innovative, very where we have many potentials, not just for integration for them, but also for society as a whole. However, what is missing is this whole institutional support level. So that gives them recognition, that gives them support structures that they can use. And migrant entrepreneurship in Intercultural are single initiatives, as I said before. And when one project fails, that's it. So no one knows about that. No one knows about the experiences, the difficulties. So what we need would be really a collection of all these experiences, the creation of kind of support network, as we see it in different other contexts where this is consolidated. But this institutional support network, also by other migrants, would be really crucial in order to learn from the experiences and learn from this single experience and personal experience. So in order to develop more real opportunities, there's significant need to increase the awareness of the positive role that migrants also can play. So they are not just the passive ones who take all jobs they can get, but they are also co-creators, and they are also able to start up new processes. They start up a new shop where they can contribute to the development of the territory. And the potential also that migrant entrepreneurship are potentially also, if the idea or the shop has success, they are also creating jobs. They are also creating training places. So this potential is often overlooked by the institutional level. So it can be instrumental in reducing unemployment, in providing new opportunities, and that leads at the end to help them to get out of the poverty trip and to give them alternatives to the difficulties, as we heard, they face at the gainful in front of the gainful employment market. This is just a very short insight, and I would be happy to answer the question or deepen some, focusing on some points.
Thank you. And I think this is a very important perspective, because often when talking about diversity management, also reading the literature on it, it's often about the companies and the employers and how they deal with the diversity they have within their labor force. And very often the voices of the migrants themselves or other diverse groups, because obviously diversity management is not just migrants, is in a way hidden. It's not, it doesn't become visible. I know that Maura, you were in charge, or you have a project that tries to identify these skills of people with migration background, for example, and make them agents of change for economies and so on. I forgot the title of the project.
This was a project that I ran together with other colleagues for the ISMO Foundation, that probably many of you know, and was within the Dimicome project. Dimicome project was diversity, inclusion, and intercultural competence to valorize migrants, adding value of the migrants in the labor market. And the peculiarity of this project was to look at different actors. So migrants, NGOs, that many migrants associations that many times work in the welcoming or in at the arrival migrant support. Job agency, as I said, which make an important role in the job market. And despite the job agency, which most of the time are private, there are also all the public services for disadvantaged people support in integration in the work market, in the labor market. And what we did was we interviewed in part of this project. What we did, we collected the different viewpoints of these different actors. And one of the problems, which I didn't mention before, but it was part of the bureaucratic issues that probably Marzia also highlighted, is connected with the no possibility, especially for third country migrants, again, of recognizing the certification and the education levels. This is apparently one of the main criticality in the support that we can provide to migrants, even though this is partially a problem, because when I work with corporates, many corporates, honestly, I know people high level. There was a question about high level educated migrants and low level. With the corporates, there are migrants with a high education, and corporates couldn't care less about what's the formal education title, or if it's recognizable or not according to our system. If they do not have the barrier of a public call or a public grant where you need to, where there are some criteria. I mean, the selection process or the hiring and selection process has a different path. So I would say corporates do not self-limit themselves once they decided to start with projects for migrants inclusion, and especially if they are looking for high qualified migrants. So the recognition of the certification, it wouldn't be such a barrier for them. I perceive this barrier, which is a bias in my view, is sometimes even what we call an unconscious bias for many of the work, how do you call it, social workers that works for the public companies or a public enterprise, and which provides services for migrants, because they start to talk about this problem of recognition. But the private sectors many times look for competency, not necessarily for the titles. So this could be a false issues, and it could be overcome without such a big problems. The problem is that in Italy, at least, the percentage of high qualified migrant is very low, especially of refugees. We are starting having more and more migrants who are entering with a study permission. So they come to study at the university. They enroll to the Italian university, particularly to the university which provide courses in English or an international career. And this is a migration path that increased enormously in the last few years, which can also be an opportunity because it brings us more qualified migrants into the job market and in terms of skills, and that many companies could valorize for internationalization strategies, for instance. And this is what, in a small scale, but is what happened in the job market. So definitely there is a difference between high qualified and low qualified, even though if we look at the medium-sized enterprises, particularly the mechanic industry, for instance, the agriculture, the building, construction, I mean, the industry that have a higher shortage of skills, and they need migrants to replace those empty roles. In this situation, the word chat, so the introduction, the informal modalities to select migrants is the ones that many times dominate, which means that in this industry, it's also possible that there is an overqualification. So migrants cover roles, but they are upskilled, they have a higher level of skills, considering the role they are actually doing. And there are some companies, also in the service industry, there are some companies that started to make an analysis of the demography of the workforce, and they started to do what we call a competency balance or an assessment center in order to map the competency they have and in order to discover if they have higher qualified people in certain roles. And few companies also started to give career opportunities to the migrants which are overqualified for what they are doing. And what we did with this ISMO project was to create some guidelines, particularly for roles that work with migrants in career orienteering or recruitment and selection, providing concrete suggestions about how to recognize and how to valorize the skills that migrants have, particularly also the informal skills that some of them might have developed along the immigration journey, particularly languages, intercultural skills, adaptability, flexibility, collaboration, those kind of skills. I
think you have shared the links to this project, right? So
yes, it's one of the links I provide you, and actually this guideline exists in Italian and in English. It's in 2 languages.
There's some questions from the audience that kind of tie into this. So somebody asks about examples of South Tyrolean companies that implement types of diversity management in their business processes. So obviously in the Dimicome project, I saw there's also case studies of Italian companies, but maybe Marzia, you could, if you remember any kind of good practices, you don't need to name individual companies, but maybe some examples of diversity management or diversity practices, policies in South Tyrol.
Yeah, I must also apologize because I think I deleted by mistake a question that was addressed to me, and then I clicked on answer and it disappeared.
Okay.
Sorry, but just to quickly answer also that question posed by Michael Bochorny, if I pronounce it correctly. He was asking whether we explicitly asked about to the companies if they would be interested and in which type of training on diversity. That was not a question we directed to companies. The topic came out in some of the interviews, and the feeling is in general that the investment of time would be significant. So company needs to develop the awareness about how important it is. We are not still there. So as to discuss the conditions, costs, duration of such a training, we first need to get to the point that, yes, we do really need such a training. Hope this answer. And then about some of the good practices we mapped here, we got across something along the line that Maura was mentioning, so a balance of competencies that is adopted by a big firm working in the field of services. And yeah, so, and that is explicitly targeted to workers with a migration background to facilitate the identification of competencies that are not certified by a formal degree. We got across good practice in practices in the realm of recruitment, so the job speed date and sort of job fairs in which it is like made easier to present and get in touch among candidates and employers. Then something that also takes place in smaller firms that I think it's an interesting case of flexible answer to the needs is a sort of bank so the possibility to accumulate holidays so that someone can then take longer break if he or she needs to stay away from work for longer than the normal 2 weeks of holiday in the summer period. That is one. Then I would need to go through the publication, which is, by the way, available, and you can have a look at this at some of these good practices in the publication that you can find in the link that Johanna shared with you at the beginning of the webinar.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but there's one more question for Claudia. So within the Italian context, how do you differentiate between immigrant entrepreneurs being innovative versus viewing self-employment as the main option in a labor market? So opening a shop versus being unemployed. How do you differentiate these two sides in your research and methods? Claudia, do you want to quickly take a minute to answer the question? You're muted.
Yes.
Yeah.
So being innovative versus viewing self as a labor. I just read the question because between immigrant entrepreneurs being innovative and viewing self-employment. Okay, so I used the concept of social innovation just as a lens to analyze migrant entrepreneurship. I don't differentiate between those who are innovative and those who are not innovative. Self-employment is always a process. So from those, I can only speak from the examples that I know, but generally, migrant entrepreneurs have a long experience in the labor market. So they have the experience of the labor market. They openly criticize the labor market. So they openly talk about what they want to change in their life. And so this is the main motivation for self-employment. So that they opened a shop. So people who are unemployed for a very long time are not in the position to open a shop. So to take this path to start this process, because it's a very long process. So it's something that comes out of a certain experience, and reflecting this experience in the labor market, and then starting their own shop. And in this process, I analyze social innovation aspects. So I don't know if I have understood the question and if this answer is okay. But there is not this differentiation that I make between those who are innovative and those who see them as the main option in the labor market, because at the end I analyzed the outcome, so the experience of being self-employed, not
Thank you, Claudia. I think the questions from the audience have all been answered. I don't know if somebody else wants to ask any further questions. Otherwise, I would like to thank mainly the speakers, the three speakers, for all the very fascinating insights. We would have needed far more time. There's so many things that went untouched and that could be explored in more depth, but I hope that the additional resources that we shared in the chat might help. If any of the attendees would want to get in touch with us, you can find us by Googling us, basically, and you'll find our email addresses if you have any more questions to any of us. So thank you so much for the inputs, the questions, and I hope to see you at the next webinar, which will take place in February. We are still working on figuring out the dates and the exact topic, but we will announce it on the webinar website that I have posted in the chat. So hopefully I'll see many of you there. So thank you and have a good remaining afternoon. Bye.